The issue of centralization is happening on a literal micro and macro level. World War II is without a doubt a pivotal moment in our history, but one of the most overlooked consequences of World War II was the centralization of our life. Governments became increasingly collectivized, whether it was fascism in Mussolini's Italy, whether it was Nazism, whether it was Russia's Soviet communism system, or even FDR's New Deal system. The world got more and more collectivized. Socialist governments rose, and whatever name they went under, society in general was under more government control than ever before. And along with it, a centralized food system, a centralized media system, and rule by experts who more and more planned out our lives and sold it to us, packaged it, and attracted us to where they wanted us to go. The 1992 Rio Summit, the United Nations Earth Summit on Sustainable Development, where they made important declarations for what became known as Agenda 21, the agenda for the 21st century.
Agenda 21, Mr. President, distinguished delegates, establishes for the first time a framework for the systemic cooperative action required to effect the transition to sustainable development. And its some 115 program areas define the concrete actions required to carry out this transition.
All this factors in to what kind of lifestyle you can have in a concentrated smart city, compacted in the name of saving the environment, smaller spaces, smaller cars, upwards and inwards, smaller footprints, more people living in less space than ever before. The issue with smart cities is one of centralization, physically compacted into dense urban zones, double the size of existing population centers. But there's also the centralization of power, a global centralization. The very issue of climate change has been centered around being a planetary scale problem.
We have to face up. Global risks, like those of climate change and ozone depletion, have become more immediate and acute.
Because of climate change, you're supposed to use less energy, have less impact on the globe, have a smaller family. On the macro level, it's all about expanding global power. Look what happened with the nuclear issue.
The atomic age was born.
In the wake of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II, other countries got a hold of nuclear power and it became a global threat that needed a global response.
There is no denying that since that moment, the shadow of the atom bomb has been across all our lives.
Rationale for creating the United Nations, which in part could help to control nuclear proliferation.
That a realistic control of atomic weapons can and will be achieved.
And it gave more global power because of a crisis that was too big for one nation or group of nations to contain. The same thing is happening with climate change. It's an issue too big for countries or individuals. It takes a global response.
This conference must establish the foundations for effecting the transition to sustainable development. This can only be done through fundamental changes in our economic life. Environment must be integrated into every aspect of our economic policy and decision making.
This gives a mandate for more global control. The United Nations has tried to push for regulating carbon dioxide, for instituting a carbon tax.
Emission permits that are tradable internationally. Taxes on polluting products or activities like the CO2 taxes now being levied or proposed.
Global environmental issues in a big way.
Central to the issues that we are going to be dealing with here are patterns of production and consumption in the industrialized world that are undermining the Earth's life support systems. This is the other part of the population problem. The fact that every child born in the developed country consumes 20 to 30 times the resources. This growth model is simply not sustainable for the rich, nor can it be replicated by the poor.
If everybody's raising living standards to the point where everybody's got a car and everybody's got air conditioning and everybody's got a big house, well, the planet will boil over.
We are now a species out of control. Each individual person is precious, and the planet must honor and support all its children. But overall, this growth cannot continue. Population must be stabilized, and rapidly. To continue along this pathway could lead to the end of our civilization.
Human activity will be reined in, including energy use, the amount of services, and the amount of consumption that people can have.
We need to meet a new constraint, and that constraint has to do with CO2.
Look at Bill Gates' 2010 TED Talk, where he talked about
Somehow we have to make changes that will bring that down to zero.
how we have to bring the amount of carbon dioxide close to zero
CO2 that you want to get to zero.
by bringing one of the numbers in his equation close to zero.
First, we've got population. Now, the world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on
new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services,
we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
This was all just echoing decades of population control, eugenics, and attempts at elitist control over the population so they could have more of those that they wanted in society and fewer of those that they didn't.
The transition to a more energy-efficient economy that weans us off our over-dependence on fossil fuels is imperative to the achievement of sustainable development.
They're building sustainable development buildings, concentrated growth, mixed development, places where mostly single people live, mostly in their 20s and 30s. And they're going to bring even more people into the city by encouraging living in tiny micro apartments, driving smaller, smart cars, and by using and having less. Having families will become discouraged because it will become more burdensome and more expensive.
Countries must leave here with confidence to commit themselves to the substantial reorientations of policies and redeployment of their own resources called for Agenda 21.
People in the midst of society in their middle working years are finding less and less high-paying industrial blue-collar jobs that once made for a vibrant middle class and strong middle class families. Instead, things have shrunk down to what's often part-time, lower-paying, service-oriented jobs because suddenly the traditional manufacturing has evaporated overseas in the days of globalization. But now the baby boomers are aging. They're starting to need a lot of medical care. Many of them are facing cancer, heart disease, degenerative disease in numbers never before seen in society. They're increasingly having to turn to a social safety net, to an increasingly socialized medical care system, increasingly to government provided services like Medicare and Medicaid, as well as to the transition to Obamacare medicine. How incredible is that they're having at the same time fewer children to take care of them. Those fewer children are having even fewer children. Maybe one, maybe two at the most, maybe none at all. Who's going to take care of them when they get older? Well, they're going to rely on no one but themselves and their relationship to the increasingly centralized government. And the children that they might have will be almost entirely wards of the state. They'll be raised as global citizens. But what happens when the population's reduced? Look in extremity to that movie, Children of Men. What happens when no one can have children at all? It's a complete chaotic police state, and you rely upon central control and what you're allowed to do.
I can't really remember when I last had any hope, and I certainly can't remember when anyone else did either. Because really, since women stopped being able to have babies, what's left to hope for?
You have no one else to turn to, and the rest is up to the socialized system. If they're there for you, you might be okay. But if that system is threatened, stressed, if it collapses, or if it simply no longer cares about you, well, you're in the crosshairs.
Sustainable development is the only viable pathway. Fortunately, that pathway is still an option, but the option is closing.